So let's review the structures of the skin. And since the epidermis is the most superficial of those structures, let's start there. So remember that the epidermis is a stratified squamous epithelium. So we've got multiple layers of flattened cells in this tissue. So this tissue is ideal for the epidermis since the top layers of the epidermis are dead and cells are continuously shed from that superficial surface. Now that function or that feature helps protect the deeper cells and deeper tissues from damage because these superficial ones are not only dead but are also easily sloughed off. And we see that new cells continuously replace the dead cells that are flaked off or sloughed off at the top. And these new cells come from the deeper layers of the epidermis and are pushed superficially. So not only is the epidermis a stratified squamous epithelium, it's a special type of stratified squamous epithelium in that it produces a tough fibrous protein that's called keratin. Now keratin helps reinforce these epidermal cells after they have died, and it helps them behave as a single continuous sheet, and that aids in the epidermis's protective function. So depending on the location of the epidermal tissue, there are either 4 or 5 distinct layers depending on its, as I mentioned, depending on its location. And there are also 4 different types of cells that compose the epidermis. So in the locations on the body where what we call thin skin is present, there are 4 epidermal layers, or what are referred to as 4 epidermal strata. Now, thin skin is found everywhere on the surface of the body except for the palms of the hand and the soles of the feet. So for thin skin, we see that there are 4 strata, and from superficial to deep, these strata are the stratum corneum, which is the most superficial layer. We have the stratum granulosum underneath that, the stratum spinosum, deeper to the stratum granulosum, and then finally the deepest layer or the deepest strata, I should say, of the epidermis is referred to as the stratum basale. So a very easy way to remember the first letter of each of these layers is the saying, "Come get sunburnt." So in thick skin, we actually have 5 epidermal strata, and the parts of the body with thick skin, that is the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet, we have this 5th epidermal strata that's called the stratum lucidum that's actually sandwiched between the stratum corneum and the stratum granulosum, which we see here. So the stratum lucidum tends to be a thin layer that exists between the stratum corneum and the stratum granulosum. So these 5 strata from superficial to deep are the stratum corneum, that's the most superficial, the stratum lucidum, followed by the stratum granulosum. Even deeper is the stratum spinosum, and finally the deepest is the stratum basale. So an easy way to remember the first letter of the layers in thick skin is the phrase or the saying, "Come, let's get sunburned." So now that we've looked at the layers and their order, let's take a look at the epidermal cell types. Now, it's one tissue, right? Stratified squamous epithelium, but that doesn't mean that there can't exist different cell types within that one tissue type. And we see that certainly in the skin, but we see that in other organ systems as well, other organs and organ systems as well. So we see that there are 4 major epidermal cell types. And the first that I point out here is the keratinocyte. And the keratinocyte is a cell that constitutes the majority of the epidermal cells. And they're called keratinocytes because they produce the keratin fibers that help strengthen the epidermis. So in addition to producing keratin, they also produce abundant desmosomes, which help to lock the epidermal cells together as a single continuous sheet. And this is true even when the cells have been pushed to the very superficial surface of the skin and those cells have died. And they're also highly abundant in tight junctions as well. And these tight junctions help the epidermis resist water loss across its surface. In the deep layers of the epidermis, particularly the stratum basale, there are these scattered cell types that are called melanocytes, and melanocytes are a branched cell that produce a brownish black, or sometimes it's a yellowish red pigment called melanin. Now, this pigment is created by these melanocytes, and then it is distributed to the keratinocytes. And so this pigment melanin helps to shield the keratinocytes from sunlight. In particular, they shield the cells from ultraviolet or UV light that comes from the sun, because that can damage the DNA in our keratinocytes and lead to skin cancer. So taking a look at the melanocytes here, we see that the melanocytes have these arm-like extensions that reach out to nearby keratinocytes, and in doing so, these extensions help deliver melanin pigment through little vesicles to those keratinocytes. Now, the melanin, in this image, the melanin is the reddish-brown grains that you see that are clustering above the nucleus, kind of like a little umbrella here. So we see the nucleus of the cell, and above it we see these little kind of reddish-brown kind of umbrellas that are shielding the nucleus. So sunlight and the UV light that is part of the spectrum of light that comes from the sun, UV light actually damages the DNA within the nucleus of the cell, and so melanin actually helps to provide a sunshade or a shield against sunlight for that nucleus. Back to our epidermal cell types, so we've seen keratinocytes and melanocytes. The last two cell types that we see are dendritic cells and tactile cells. We have not quite as many dendritic cells as we do keratinocytes, but they're still important in their own way. Dendritic cells are star-shaped cells that act essentially on behalf of the immune system. They destroy foreign substances or microorganisms that happen to get into the epidermis. You may also see these cells referred to as Langerhans cells. And finally, we have tactile cells. So as their name implies, tactile means touch. And so these are touch-sensitive cells that are principally located in the stratum basale of the epidermis. Their function is to detect very light touches on the epidermal surface. And you may also see these tactile cells referred to as Merkel cells. So taking a look at those, the tactile cells tend to be these spiny little these spiny-shaped cells that are typically found between the keratinocytes of the stratum basale. And here in the stratum basale, they are associated with a sensory neuron that comes up from the dermal tissue to make a close association with that tactile cell. And together, that tactile cell, that Merkel cell, delivers sensory touch stimuli information to that sensory neuron, and that sensory neuron carries that information to our brain. So that's a little bit how our tactile cells work, and we'll look at those sensory receptors in a lot more detail in chapter 13 when we get to the peripheral nervous system. So now that we're introduced to the tissue type of the epidermis and the cell type of the epidermal layers, let's take a look at the processes that are occurring within each layer of the epidermis. And again, so we'll actually start opposite this time. We'll start with the stratum basale, and we'll kind of make our way superficially, kind of following the fate or the path of the keratinocytes as they're pushed superficially. So recall that the stratum basale is a single layer of cells that exists at the deepest part of the epidermis, and that stratum basale sits right up against the dermal tissue. So what we see primarily happening in the stratum basale is that the keratinocytes that are present there are undergoing mitosis, and these new keratinocytes that are being produced by mitosis push older keratinocytes superficially. So we've got mitosis creating new keratinocytes in the stratum basale, and that action pushes old keratinocytes superficially towards the surface of the skin. We also see melanocytes in this layer that are delivering melanin pigment to the keratinocytes as they are being pushed upward or superficially. And we also see tactile cells in this layer, which we just saw on the previous slide, and they function to detect light touches on the surface of the skin. So it's important to note here that because we see keratinocyte mitosis producing new skin cells, it's important to note here that any kind of strong or continuous mechanical forces, so for example a shoe that doesn't fit particularly well, is going to end up rubbing against the skin pretty much almost constantly, and these mechanical forces over time can actually cause accelerated mitosis of the keratinocytes and create a thickening of that skin within that area or that region there. And these thickened regions are referred to as calluses. Now, calluses are different from warts. Warts are actually caused by a virus rather than mechanical forces. Even though they kind of superficially look the same, calluses and warts have different origins for how they're created in the skin, even though they may look similar kind of superficially. Okay, so moving on up from deep to superficial now, we'll take a look at the stratum spinosum. So this is a layer that's, or a couple of layers that sits just above or superficial to the stratum basale. This layer is mostly keratinocytes. It does have a few dendritic cells patrolling the area here. So recall that dendritic cells essentially patrol the epidermis and destroy any dirt, debris, bacteria, microorganisms that may have gotten through the dead layers of the epidermis and down to the living layers here. So the dendritic cells are essentially, again, acting on behalf of the immune system and making sure that dirt and debris don't get, and microorganisms don't get to deeper layers within the skin. So the keratinocytes that are in this layer tend to produce a high number of desmosomes, and these desmosomes will join the keratinocytes together as a single continuous sheet. And these desmosomes help them stay together even after the cells have died. So we tend to see also not only an increase in the number of desmosomes in keratinocytes in this layer, but we also see an increase in the number of tight junctions between the keratinocytes in this layer as well. So that's externally. So internally, we actually, if we look inside the keratinocytes themselves, we see that they're accumulating, or they begin accumulating a large amount of keratin precursors, what we call prekeratin, inside of their cytoskeleton. Remember, the cell skeleton helps hold the cell together and give it structure and support from within. So we see that the amount of prekeratin in the keratinocyte cytoskeleton begins to increase within this layer. So moving superficially, we now move to the stratum granulosum. This layer is approximately 1 to 5 cell layers in thickness. And this layer, kind of unsurprisingly, is named for these small dark-colored granules that are visible within the cell. So they take on kind of a sandy or gritty appearance here. We see that there are 2 types of granules that are present in this layer, even though the granules may be indistinguishable from one another in microscope images and things like that. We actually see functionally that these are 2 different types of granules. The first type is what we call a keratohyalin granule, and these contain a substance that convert the prekeratin fibers in the cytoskeleton into keratin, and so these contain a substance that facilitate the conversion of prekeratin to keratin in these cells. We also see another type of granule called lamellar granules, and lamellar granules contain a glycolipid, and this glycolipid helps to essentially make the cells water resistant when the keratinocytes die. So what happens is these glycolipids break open when the cells die. Those glycolipids are released from those granules and help create a water-resistant lipid coating in this layer, and also, or I should say in superficial layers, as this layer, these cells aren't quite dead yet. But in superficial layers, when these granules break open, the lipids are released and help create a water-resistant coating. And this coating helps reduce water loss across the surface of the skin. We also see in this layer, the stratum granulosum, that the keratinocytes begin to die. Now, they're not dead yet, but they do begin the process of cell death at this point. Next, we have the stratum lucidum. So recall that this is found only in thick skin, that is, skin that's on the palms of the hand or on the soles of the feet. Now, this layer is typically between 1 and 3 layers in thickness in terms of cell cell layers, and so it's a rather thin layer compared to things like the stratum spinosum and even the stratum corneum, which sits above it. So it's typically between 1 and 3 cell layers thick and consists primarily of dead keratinocytes. And so As I mentioned earlier, this layer sits just underneath the stratum corneum, but just above the stratum granulosum here. So this is our first layer that we've encountered where we see completely dead keratinocytes. And finally, we have the stratum corneum, which is the most superficial layer of our epidermis. This is a very thick layer. This often tends to be the thickest layer of the epidermis, and it usually contains anywhere between 20 and 30 cell layers in thickness. Now recall that the stratum granulosum is where the keratinocytes began to die, and here in the stratum corneum is where they form a completely dead sheet that covers the external surface of our skin. And we also see that those glycolipids that were created in the stratum granulosum and released here help to make this layer water resistant. So this is a completely dead layer of cells. The keratinocytes have been toughened by the keratin that they produced. They're linked together very tightly by the desmosomes and the tight junctions that they produced in earlier layers like the stratum spinosum. And then the glycolipids that were produced in the stratum granulosum have been released to help protect this layer against water loss from deeper tissues. So we see that this layer is both chemically and mechanically protected in several ways.